Hi, happy Halloween. I'm Jerrel from Sungrant, developer of the Silver Falls games. Today, I wanted to discuss a topic that is part of my process when creating horror. And that is, what is effective horror, and how do you ruin horror? How do you make it no longer scary? So, before we get started, let's all just have a sip of our coffee and enjoy a nice relaxing Halloween vibe. Fantastic. Now, when I am coming up with a concept, a setup, a story for horror, what is extremely important is the setup. The setup has to be one that allows whoever is participating in the story to not have full control. And very effective horror is a lack of control and incomplete understanding. Those are the two main basic rules that I follow when creating and writing horror, is a lack of control and incomplete understanding. Now, I don't say a lack of understanding, because as the saying goes, ignorance is bliss. If you don't even have a slight understanding of something, you don't understand it, it's not on your radar, so it doesn't really matter to you. What does matter is when you see something that you can almost understand, but not all of the information is there. So you have an incomplete understanding, and it's important for the viewer or the player or the reader to be given information in a way that asks that viewer to fill in the blanks. And how you get horror to be effective is you sort of lead the witness a little bit into thinking of the very possible worst possibilities when filling in those blanks. And the way you do that is with your setup, your atmosphere, and your environment. So, magicians and psychics all do something called priming, where they prime people to believe something. You prime someone to pick a particular hand, particular card out of a deck of cards there. So you are priming someone to think of something, and that is extremely important with horror. That is why genre properties are so effective in terms of, say for example, a zombie movie or a zombie video game. When you tell someone this is a zombie video game, a zombie show, you have already primed those people into thinking of drawing on history of horror, of media that they are already familiar with, that already exists. So you are priming people to put those things in place. So I want to put, I want to use an example. There are many Three Down Stars fans out there at this point, which was the first Silver Falls game in the whole series. And now I'm just hearing from people all over the world who really love that game. And something that took an immense amount of discipline as a game designer, as a writer, was to hold back the horror and to prime the player into believing that there was not going to be significant horror. I primed the player into thinking that the baseline of horror was one flat, particular baseline. It was something very familiar. When people have a full understanding of something, it gives them a sense of security. And so with Three Down Stars, I showed people early on and throughout the middle section of the game that the horror is something they can understand, something they can comprehend. And towards, I would say, the last third of the game, slowly the true horror elements are introduced, and it's in the way to where players who believed that they had an understanding of the situation are, in a very shocking way, the game lets those players know you don't have an understanding of the situation at all now, because you believed you had an understanding, and after a few reveals it shows, you don't even actually know what the real, true, scary part of this experience is. But that sort of horror is always introduced in a way that is vaguely familiar. And so, in that respect, I actually primed the player into believing that they understood and believing that it wasn't that scary, while subliminally priming them into filling in the blanks in terms of horror. So there are quite a few instances in 3 Down Stars where players are given background information, just small bits and pieces, things that characters say, but usually what is most important for me when I'm writing a scene for characters who have dialogue is to think of what the audience needs to get out of that scene. What information does the audience need? What information does one character want? What information does the other character have, but they don't want to give up? To me, interesting and effective writing, and not just in horror, but writing in general, is to have one character need information, the other character have information, but they have a good reason for why they don't want to give that information. And that allows the writer to create interesting scenes where there's now like a tug of war for one character trying to get information from the other. And because that's so tense and interesting, people tend to pay more attention to that. And in that situation, you can start putting in details and then leaving out specific details, which is very important for horror writing because it allows you to hint at what the horror is, to hint at what you want the audience to think and believe. So, for me, that is very important. And when it comes to, say, for example, monster behavior and monster design, I tend to lean into the aspect of you do not have control. So something that makes for good horror is when you come up against a monster and you can't just shoot this monster, bang, 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 stabby, stabby, stab. Now I've beaten that monster. That gives people a sense of safety and security. What if you had a monster that was very difficult to hit because of the way they moved? What if you had a monster who could just, hold on, there we go. Get out of here, get out of here, scram, get out of here, go, scram, frustrating, you should never, just die, monster. Okay, I think I got them all. Don't worry, everyone. I'm pretty good with this thing. Level 25 with that. No big deal. I got rid of them. Don't worry about that. So, what makes for effective horror is when monsters engage in a way where it is very difficult. You can't deal with those monsters in a linear, straightforward way that you normally have been throughout the game. So it's important to have, unfortunately, the term would be trash mobs, enemies that allow the player to feel a sense of security and think, oh, I can deal with this enemy. Suddenly you introduce something like a bat, and that is good horror, because a bat can move in a squiggly line, a Medusa head can move in a squiggly line, and suddenly it is very difficult to deal with that enemy. It's difficult to hit that enemy. The consequences of failing against that enemy can be quite high often. It can mean a game over for that level. And so, when creating enemy behavior and enemy AI, and just in terms of overall mechanics for not just 3 Down Stars, but the majority of all the Silver Falls titles, depending on the game, is when I really need to lean into the horror, I have enemies that are very difficult to deal with. So, in 3 Down Stars, there is a mechanic where you can flinch enemies after you deal a certain amount of armor damage, and armor damage is a hidden value. Everyone understands the concept of damaging an enemy's health points, or HP. So you damage the HP, but in 3 Down Stars, and also episode Prelude, there is an element to combat that is hidden called armor points. And every weapon has a varying amount of damage towards your armor points. So enemies will not flinch and they won't stagger until you damage their armor points enough. Once you've damaged their armor points enough, then they flinch, and that gives you an opportunity to run away, to switch weapons, to heal. But when I need enemies to be more scary, more horrifying, more difficult to deal with, that enemy has more armor points, more armor health, which means that it's much harder to flinch those enemies, so they'll have a bit of Terminator effect, where they will continue to approach, and even though the player does not fully understand it, they recognize what is happening, and they subconsciously think, I can't stop this guy. I've been able to stop the other enemies just by shooting them in the face, but this one's not stopping. And people may not consciously think of that, but they understand it, and that lends to an effective design for horror for enemies. So HP isn't everything. damage isn't everything. There are other mechanics that come into play when developing strong horror elements for a game experience. Something that I also really enjoy and lean into when designing my creatures for horror is I tend to create creatures that have something physically familiar about them. Say, for example, The Thing from 1982. The creature designs are just horrifying. They're just shocking and visceral. And that is because the creature designs in The Thing are familiar. We see the creature designs and we recognize, oh, that's okay, there's parts that's kind of a dog, or oh, that's kind of a person. And when the movie needs to elevate that horror experience, it starts leaning more into the abstract, but it still retains things that are vaguely familiar to us. It looks like there are bones in there. It looks like, you can see fingers and hands and an eyeball. Those are things that we recognize, but more and more of the creature becomes unrecognizable, which makes it more horrifying because it means we have more of an incomplete understanding. I will compare that to the original creature design from The Thing 2011, which is a prequel, which I really enjoy. I think that's a great movie. The people that created it did an incredible job, but the creature designs early on are not that scary, particularly the first creature design in The Thing 2011. When we have a look at that creature design, there's nothing recognizable about it. It looks entirely alien. We don't see any bones that look like they could have come from an animal from Earth. In fact, it just looks like a vague insectoid alien with bendy, stabby parts that do not look recognizable at all. It does not make for effective horror because there is nothing about it we can recognize. Effective horror is an incomplete understanding, and what the original creature form in The Thing 2011 was not incomplete familiarity, it was total unfamiliarity. We were not familiar with it at all. It was a total lack of understanding of the creature, and that's not scary. People just sort of check out at that point. So, in order to have an effective horror mechanic in your game, to have an effective horror design, you need an incomplete understanding. You need something familiar that the viewer, the player, can understand, but you also need a significant amount that they don't understand, and you need to prime your viewer or your player to fill in the blanks in the most terrifying way possible. So, those are my thoughts on effective horror, and before I end the video, I just want to quickly discuss how to ruin that horror. And the most easy way to ruin a horror is with not just the setup. This can occur, I've seen this happen in a lot of media, not just in the form of the setup, but how the plot progresses as well, is to allow either the player or the protagonist to have control over the situation. I am a major fan and enjoyer of Resident Evil 5, but I do not think a single part of that game is scary. I don't think there is any effective horror in Resident Evil 5, but personally, I rate that game a 10 out of 10. I enjoy playing Resident Evil 5 with my friends, so that is why I have a positive experience with that. I think it is beautifully crafted, fantastic, but it is not scary. And the reason why Resident Evil 5 is not scary is because Chris Redfield goes out looking for trouble. So, how to ruin your horror is for your setup to have your protagonist looking for trouble. If your protagonist is looking for trouble, then automatically, in your head, the viewer or the player will think, oh, well, if they're looking for trouble, then they must be prepared for trouble. Being prepared means that you will be in control, and being in control means it's not scary, is it? It's not effective horror. The reason why Resident Evil 1 is so scary, especially compared to Resident Evil 5, is that in Resident Evil 1, the protagonists were not looking for trouble, and they were not prepared. They were looking to rescue their compatriots. And so they didn't think, oh, well, we'll just have a bunch of stuff and we'll fight some monsters, we'll beat up some monsters. They were not prepared for that. That is why Resident Evil 1 is such effective horror. Resident Evil 5, and you can also group this together with Resident Evil 6, is every single story, and every character is going out looking for trouble. They're going out to fight monsters. They're going out to be an action hero, and that is not effective horror. The reason why Aliens, the first Alien movie, is so extremely effective with horror is that none of those characters were going out looking for trouble. In fact, they were actively working to try to avoid trouble, and the trouble is forced upon them, and they have no choice now but to find a way to survive. So that is what makes effective horror, is incomplete understanding, a lack of control, and a good setup. And if you want to ruin that horror, then have your characters looking for trouble. Mid-plot, if you want to ruin your story mid-plot, even if you've had the best setup in the world, the best way you can ruin your horror mid-story is to give the protagonist, a way to have control. If that protagonist did not have control previously, and you find a way to give them overwhelming control, it's no longer scary. That's no longer effective horror. What is effective is empowerment, but limited empowerment, which means there are stipulations. There is now a way out. So strong horror gives the protagonist or the player a way out, but it is limited, controlled, and there are stipulations. Arbitrary stipulations such as, oh no, my flamethrower isn't functioning, it's not firing, even though the flamethrower was working the entire movie, the entire game. If suddenly you had the flamethrower, which is the only weapon that can defeat, say for example, the creature that players have to deal with in the game. If you get to the final boss and for no reason the flamethrower suddenly stops working, that's not horror. That's very irritating because there was no lead up to it. There are no gameplay mechanics that say, hey, here are the rules. If you don't follow the rules, here are the consequences. If you just have something arbitrary like that, again, it pulls people out of the experience. So those are my general guidelines and thoughts that I follow when I'm writing and creating horror. I thought it would be interesting to share that all with you. If you have your own thoughts, don't tell them to me, because I'm nobody. I don't even know you. It's better if, you know what, call your mom, call your dad, because they probably haven't seen you in a while. Have dinner, take your dad to a baseball game, sit down, have a drink, and then discuss your thoughts on horror with him. Because I'm nobody. If you comment down below, I'll reply, but I don't really matter. Share your thoughts with someone who matters in your life. Share your thoughts with someone important and discuss horror with them. Take care, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that. Happy Halloween. I have eaten too much candy. I've got a giant bag of candy corn. My mouth is now numb because I've eaten so much candy. So take care of yourselves, everyone, and be well.